Well, Merry Christmas, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. Welcome, welcome. If this is your first time at Crosspoint, special welcome to you. My name is Mac. I'm one of the pastors on our team. I also want to welcome all of you who are joining us from home. Thanks so much for tuning in. In fact, here's what I want to do. So I was texting with a few people this morning who knew they had to watch from home. Let's shout Merry Christmas to them on the count of 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Merry Christmas! Yes. Well, we are in our Christmas series. It's called The Sound of Christmas. And the idea is this is the time of year when we're listening to a lot of Christmas music. We often have it playing in the background, you know, when you're out driving your car or shopping or maybe just hanging out at home. If you were to stop by my house at any point in the last month, you'd hear the song Ding Dong by Rend Collective playing on repeat because that's my son Griffin's favorite song. And let me tell you, if I never have to hear that song again, it'll be a gift. I'm done with it. So we're listening to a lot of Christmas music, and these are songs we're so familiar with that they often just go in one ear and sort of out the other. And this is a bummer because in many of these songs, their lyrics are really rich and meaningful. So what we're doing in this series is we're sort of looking at a few of the most famous Christmas carols, and we're sort of using them as a springboard to dive into the truth of the Christmas story. So, you know how those classic bar jokes begin? You know, like a priest, a rabbi, and a pastor walk into a bar. You know what I'm talking about, these classic bar jokes? Turns out that it's not just bar jokes that start this way. It can also be Christmas carols, okay? So our Christmas carol for today is O Holy Night, and it basically starts with a parish priest, an atheistic poet, a Jewish composer, and then at one point, a Unitarian minister gets involved. Okay, so here's the backstory. It's an old carol. It was written in 1843 in France, okay? And the backstory is there was this church that was renovating their organ. So this was back in the day when if you wanted to impress someone, you learned an organ solo, okay? So they renovate this organ, this huge project, and when they completed it, they wanted to celebrate the moment. So this parish priest asked this famous French poet to write a Christmas poem so that they could celebrate Christmas in a special way. Here's the thing. This poet was an atheist and had a strong disdain towards religion, but he agreed to do it. So he writes O Holy Night based on Luke 2. It starts to gain some popularity, and eventually this Jewish composer decides to put it to music. It continues to grow in its popularity. And finally, this guy named John Dwight Sullivan, he translated it to English and brought it to the United States, and it blew up big time. That is the story of O Holy Night. A parish priest, an atheistic poet, a Jewish composer, and a Unitarian minister come up with a Christmas carol. And it's quite a famous carol. Now, the theme of this carol is holiness. It's called O Holy Night. Right? This is the first line in the song, O Holy Night. And in the final verse of this song, it calls us to worship God's holy name. And so what this carol is doing is it's describing the arrival of Jesus into the world as a holy moment. It's a holy night. So what I want to do this Christmas is preach to you on the topic of holiness. But I want to name my hope on the outset. My hope is that as we zoom in on how God's holiness is revealed in the Christmas story, we would once again be wowed and captivated by the truth of who God is in the person of Jesus. And I'm going to name this as a hope because one of the things I've noticed is that when it comes to Christmas, we're just so familiar with the story that it sort of loses sometimes some of its pop. Some of its punch. We celebrate this thing annually. So every year we're kind of leaning in and we're so familiar with this story that it just no longer captivates us. It's kind of like when a new song comes out on the radio and you instantly fall in love with this song, right? And so every time you get in your car, you're sort of searching for that song. And when you find it, you turn up the volume, kind of crank it up a little bit, you get into the song. But what happens over time is these radio stations, they play the popular song again and again and again. And so over time, what happens is you get in your car and you're no longer looking for the song. And when you land on it, you don't turn the volume up, you sort of turn the station because you've had enough of it, right? It's like Ding Dong by Rend Collective. But see, this can happen with the Christmas story. We hear it year after year, and because we're so familiar with it, it no longer takes our breath away. It no longer knocks us off our feet. It no longer dazzles or wows us. It's just sort of the Christmas story. But I'm hoping as we look at this Christmas story and see how God's holiness is revealed in this story, it will knock us off our feet. And we'll be blown away by this mind-bending, mind-blowing, category-shifting, unbelievable good news. The good news about Jesus. So here's our big idea. If there's one thing you walk away with this Christmas, let it be this. God's holiness, everybody say holiness. There we go. God's holiness is revealed in the good news. Say good news. The good news of Jesus Christ. What we're going to see today is that God takes on flesh in Jesus. So God is revealing God's very self to us in Jesus, and this includes God's holiness. Jesus reveals to us what God's holiness is like. And here's the thing, is it's unlike how anybody had conceived of it, and it's so much better. So we're going to jump into this theme here. The theme of holiness is not just a big idea in the song, O Holy Night. It's actually a huge theme throughout the Bible. Throughout the Bible, God is described as being holy. It's one of his primary attributes. So I'm going to just throw two verses up on the screen. The first one is from Isaiah 6. And the context here is there's this vision of God sitting on his throne in heaven, and everybody around is worshiping, saying, "Holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." Okay? This same vision, a very similar one, occurs in the New Testament in Revelation 4. Again, God is sitting on his throne. People are around the throne worshiping, and they're saying, "Holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." God is holy. This is one of his primary attributes that's affirmed throughout the Bible. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. Everybody agrees on this, that God is holy. But see, the question is, what does that even mean? What does it mean to say or affirm that God is holy? And I want to submit to you this Christmas, if you're going to answer that question, you need to look at the person of Jesus. Here's point number one for us this Christmas. God reveals God's holiness in the person of Jesus. God reveals his holiness in Jesus. Now, if you've been at Crosspoint for any length of time, this whole idea of looking at God in order to know, looking at Jesus in order to know who God is nothing new. We talk about this all the time, that all of our thinking about God has to center on Jesus and match what we see in Jesus. And the reason why is because God is revealing himself to us in Jesus. Jesus is God in the flesh. And this is made explicit in the Christmas story. So let's look at this verse in Matthew 1:23. Here's what it says. It says, "The virgin," referring to Mary, "will conceive and give birth to a son," referring to Jesus, "and they will call him Emmanuel," which means what? God with us. So the name Emmanuel means God with us. Jesus is God with us. He's God in the flesh. The author of Hebrews says that Jesus is the radiance of the divine nature and the exact representation of his being. Paul says that he's the image of the invisible God and the fullness of God dwells in him. And Jesus said, "If you see me, you see the Father." And every theologian worth his sauce has affirmed this to be true. So here's a few quotes for you that I hope will inspire you. This first one is from Karl Barth. He says, "We know God in Jesus alone." You want to know who God is? You know God in Jesus alone. C.S. Lewis said, "Jesus is what the Father has to say." What does God the Father have to say? Well, you have to look at Jesus to discover that. If you want to know who God is, look at Jesus. N.T. Wright. Everything you believe about God has to center on Jesus and match what you see in Jesus. And if it doesn't match Jesus, I would suggest you need to throw it out. And this includes how we understand God's holiness. And so the question is the way that you think about God's holiness, does that match what you see in Jesus? That's the question. Quick show of hands, how many of you have seen the movie The Princess Bride? Oh, wow. Okay, let's pop quiz then. Pop quiz. See if you can finish this line. "No more rhyming now, I mean it." Yes, who said that? Raise your hand. oh, I wish I had a prize for you, But I'm not Oprah, You get a car, everybody gets cars. Just kidding. There's another funny moment in that movie, you may remember. It's when Vicini, he's like that short guy, bald. He keeps calling everything inconceivable. You guys remember this part? Like anytime his plan gets foiled, he calls it inconceivable, even though it's happening like right in front of his eyes. And so this kind of prompts the swordsman, Inigo. He goes, hey, you keep using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means. You keep using that word, but I don't think that means what you think it means. And I think there's something similar going on with the word holiness. People keep using that word, but I don't think it means what they think it means. It doesn't match what we see in Jesus. So let's just establish a baseline. The word holy, it literally means to be set apart. That's what the word holy means. It means to be set apart or distinct from. And often it's set apart for a particular purpose, a consecrated purpose, okay? Sometimes this has a moral quality to it, but oftentimes it doesn't. In fact, this is what the entire book of Leviticus is about. If you've ever gotten stuck in Leviticus, that's totally normal. It's a very boring book. But at its heart, it's just naming, I'm going to show you how to create a holy space, a space set apart from your normal space to worship me. And it's all these instructions about what this space should look like and how the Israelites can stay fit for that sacred space, that space set apart from their normal space. But see, what happens oftentimes with this word holiness is it gets wrapped into a narrative that goes like this. See, God is so morally pure and sinless, so morally set apart that he can't even be near sin or look upon sin, otherwise it will compromise his holiness. Is this making sense? The idea is God is so holy and morally set apart that he can't be near sin, otherwise it would compromise his holiness. It's almost as if you've got this tension in God between his holiness and his love. You've got his love on the one hand and his holiness on the other, and his holiness keeps his love in check. God wants to be near us because he loves us, but see, we're sinful, and so God's holiness won't allow him to be near us. This is the way it often gets narrated. So there's this conundrum in God. What is he supposed to do about this? And the answer for many people is that, well, he sent Jesus to sort of take on the wrath of God, the punishment for our sin, because that's what his holiness and justice required, and that sort of frees God up so that he can be near us and love us and forgive us. Is this making sense? You've got God's holiness, and you've got God's love. God wants to be near us, but he can't because we're sinful. And so Jesus sort of absorbs the wrath that God's holiness demands so that it frees God up and love wins out in the end. Just making sense? And the question we have to ask is this really what we see in Jesus? And I want to submit to you that it's definitely not. It's not what we see in Jesus. In fact, if you kind of follow that all the way through, you basically end up with a God who's like a cosmic Santa Claus, who's obsessed with our behavior, whether we've been naughty or nice. He's kind of keeping track of all the things we've done. And if we're naughty, and we all are, well then that means he can't be near us, and he needs to punish someone in order to forgive us and love us. I submit to you that this is not how the New Testament presents Jesus. This is not what we see in the Christmas story. Now, it's true that Jesus came and he died in our place. That's definitely true. But I want to call into question this whole idea that God's holiness means he can't be near us and can't be near our sin. And the reason why is because it seems to me that the Christmas story and the entire life of Jesus, quite frankly, goes out of its way to say the exact opposite. Okay, so think on this. God reveals God's holiness in Jesus. If we have the understanding that God's holiness means God can't be near sin, then I submit to you much of the Christmas story doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Instead of a God who can't be near sin, we see the exact opposite. Consider how Jesus was born. Jesus was born to an unmarried Jewish peasant couple. Unmarried. That was scandalous. So when Jesus enters the world, he's wrapped in the scandal of sin, the assumption that Mary had an affair, yeah? Which, by the way, was punishable by death by stoning. This is how Jesus enters the world. He's wrapped up in the suspicion of sin. This is not what you'd expect from a God who can't be near sin, right? When they get to Bethlehem, they can't find room. And so they find shelter in a stable. And so Jesus is born surrounded by barn animals, yeah? Barn animals do what? They poop. They do. Have you ever been to the state fair? It's nasty. So Jesus, like God, when he takes on flesh, he's born surrounded by defecation. I mean, this isn't what you'd expect from a God who can't be around icky things, right? You keep going. Notice who shows up to welcome Jesus in the world. It's shepherds. And shepherds were often considered unclean because they're caring for these animals. It's pagan astrologers, Gentiles, who also would have been considered unclean or unholy, right? If you've got a God can't be near sin understanding of holiness, none of the Christmas story makes a whole lot of sense. And this just continues if you zoom out and sort of look at the life of Jesus and his ministry. Who did Jesus hang out with? He hung out with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes, all people who would have been considered unholy and unrighteous. Jesus, for a significant part of his ministry, cared for the sick. And when he brought healing, he would often touch people, including lepers. And lepers were considered contagious. If you came in contact with someone who had leprosy, you would then be considered unholy. But what do we see Jesus doing? He counters this contagious defilement with his contagious holiness. Jesus continually moves towards the sick, the blind, the lame, all those who are unclean and unholy. This is what the story of the prodigal father is all about. One of Jesus' most famous parables, he tells this story of a young son, two brothers, but the younger son demands his inheritance. The father gives it to him, and he goes off to a foreign land, a Gentile land, squanders everything he has, runs out of resources, and ends up caring for pigs, which were considered unclean. They would have made him unholy. Finally, he's so desperate, he decides to return home. And how does the story go? When he starts getting near the house, does the father see him and go, man, you better take a shower first? No. What we see is this father who runs out to meet him and embraces him just as he is. And there's not even a whiff that there's any tension between the father's holiness or love in that moment. Are you tracking? When you read the story, it seems the only person who had a problem with what the father does in welcoming the younger son home is who? The older brother, who in the story happens to represent the Pharisees. And then when you look at the ministry of Jesus, you discover it's the Pharisees, it's the religious leaders that have the biggest problem with Jesus. And the reason why they have the biggest problem with Jesus is because of their understanding of holiness. They assume being holy means being set apart and distant from those sinners. So it's a group of people who are constantly looking down on other people with an attitude of self-righteousness. Oh God, I thank you that I'm not like those people. That tax collector over there, thank you I'm not like that person. Because I pray every day and I fast 3 times a week. See, I'm so holy. So don't you find it fascinating that the religious leaders, the biggest objectors to Jesus' ministry, are doing so in the name of holiness and moral purity? This is insane, you guys. But it continues to happen today. Many people still have this cosmic Santa Claus view of God, where God's constantly monitoring their behavior and keeping track of whether they've been naughty or nice. And if they've been naughty, well, then God can't be near them and needs to punish them in order to forgive them and love them. I've been in ministry for almost 15 years now. And I'll tell you what, I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with someone and we start talking and they narrate this guilt and this shame they have around the mistakes they've made in their life. And it's like they're stuck in this guilt and this shame. And they feel awful about it. And you begin to like kind of examine that with them and explore, okay, well, how is God meeting you in your guilt and your shame? And they'll often talk about how God is disappointed in them and upset with them and angry with them. I once asked a guy who was describing this mistake he made and how I said, if Jesus were in the room right now, what would the look on his face be? And he looked at me and he said, it'd be a mixture of anger and disappointment, a face of disdain. And I thought, you know what? That's really bad news. Like, that's really bad news if that's how God looks at you. So why don't I share with you the good news of Jesus Christ? See, the good news isn't that Jesus saves us from the Father. The good news is that Jesus reveals the Father to us and saves us from our sin. I'll say that again. Jesus doesn't save us from the Father. He reveals the Father to us and saves us from our sin. The good news of Jesus Christ is that God moves towards us and comes near to us even when we're stuck in our sin. Romans says that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. It wasn't when you were at your best moment. It wasn't when you were crushing it. It was when you were at your worst moment, when you were totally helpless and stuck in your mess. That's when God looked at you with eyes of love and affection and tender mercy and said, I'm going to take on flesh and move towards you. Is this making sense? It doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made. It doesn't matter how big the mistake is that you made. It doesn't change God's disposition or his heart towards you. God's disposition towards you is settled, and we see it in Jesus. Far from being a God who can't come near a mess, God dives into our mess to save us from our mess. Far from a God who can't be near sin, the Bible actually tells us that he who knew no sin became our sin so that we could be reconciled. And none of this compromises God's holiness. It actually expresses God's holiness because the two are in cahoots with one another. All right, maybe this will help. I've got some chairs. I think they're from IKEA. Here's another way to think about it. And this isn't my illustration. I read it in a book and have made a few modifications. But 2 chairs, okay? Imagine this one is God, and this one is you, okay? Or all of us. At the very beginning, we're told that God created everything good, and everything was perfectly related to one another. Yes? Nothing was broken or fractured. God's facing us, we're facing God. As we most of us know, the story goes, Adam and Eve, who represent all of us, they sin, right? They break that relationship and they turn their back on God. And this represents all of us because all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Yeah? Now, one way to narrate what happens in our understanding of God's holiness is at that moment, God is so holy, so morally set apart that he can't be near or even look upon sin. And so in that moment, God turns his back on Adam and Eve because that's what his holiness requires. But what is God to do? This creates a conundrum because remember, God still loves us. He still wants to be near us, but his holiness won't allow him to turn and face us. And so for many people, again, the answer is Jesus. He sort of absorbs God's wrath and the consequences of our sin because God's holiness and justice require it, so that God is then free to turn towards us and forgive us and love us once again. But now when he looks on us, he doesn't even see us. He sees Jesus in our place and his righteousness, right? And so if we'll just turn towards Jesus, we'll end up being able to face God again. This is one common way of narrating things rooted in a particular understanding of God's holiness. And as I said before, it gets some things right, but I think it gets God's disposition wrong. In the beginning, God created everything, and it was perfect. Everything was rightly related. God is facing us, we're facing God. And yes, everybody has sinned and turned their back on God. But what happens in the story? What's the next? How does the story actually go? Does God turn his back on Adam and Eve? No, the next thing you see is God searching them out to walk with them in the cool of the day. Yeah? And there's this one Hebrew word that God shouts out. He says, Atayah, which means, where are you? Where did you go? And see, the vision is God, the picture is God's pursuing them, and he's chasing them, and he's still facing them. Yes? And this is the pattern, you guys, we see throughout the scriptures. God meets people where they're at, and when they make a mistake or they mess up, he continues to face them. So Abraham, God calls Abraham, gives him this amazing promise. Abraham believes it, but then he starts to doubt it, has something with Hagar. It's not a good move. So, he turns his back on God's promise. But God in his grace continues to face Abraham and even blesses his mistake, right? This is the entire story of the Old Testament. God chooses the nation of Israel. And they continue to mess up and make mistakes and chase after other gods, but God continues to face with them and work with them and send prophets and pursue them. And this is what we see in Jesus. There's a woman who's at a well in the middle of the day and is on her sixth man. And what does Jesus do? He comes and he faces this woman and invites her into a relationship that will involve living water. There's a woman who's presented to Jesus who's been caught in adultery, which, by the way, is really about men caught in hypocrisy, but that's a different sermon. But what does Jesus do? He turns and faces this woman and goes, hey, is there anybody else here to condemn you? Well, neither do I. Go and sin no more. There's a short guy who happens to be a tax collector and is cheating everybody in his town. And what does Jesus do? He comes and he says, hey, I'm going to eat with you today. Is this making sense? Every single story is Jesus is revealing God's heartbeat, which is a God who never stops facing us or pursuing us or chasing us. There's no limit to his love. This is a God not who can't be near sin, but takes our sin upon himself and carries it to the grave. This is a God who frees us from death by killing death itself. This is a God who frees us from captivity by taking captivity captive. This is who God is. Is this making sense? I'm telling you, this is good news. You ought to act like it. The good news of Jesus Christ is that God is for you no matter what, and this is revealed in the person of Jesus. It doesn't compromise his holiness, it actually perfectly expresses it. God's inconceivable holiness becomes concrete and conceivable in the person of Jesus, and it's better than anything we could have imagined. Now, I want to turn a corner here before I wrap up this message, and it's this. If this is how God is holy, if God's holiness is revealed in Jesus and as a God who pursues us even when we're in the middle of a mess, a God who jumps into our mess in order to deliver us and save us from our mess, then I want to suggest to you that this is how we should be in the world. So point number 2 today is this. We are called to be holy like Jesus is holy. We're called to be holy like Jesus is holy. Here's what 1 Peter 1, 15 and 16 says. Just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. We're called to be holy the same way God is holy. The way that Jesus enters the world is to be our way in the world. Friends, as a church, we're not called to be a group of Pharisees who consider ourselves morally superior to everybody else in the world and sort of put some distance between us and them and look down at other people out of a sense of self-righteousness and moral superiority. That's not what we're called to do. In fact, it's the exact opposite. As you see someone stuck in a mess or in the middle of sin, we're supposed to remember, this is how God met me. When I was stuck, when I was in a mess, God moved toward me with tender mercy and the compassion and love of Jesus Christ, right? We're not supposed to be a bunch of rent-a-Santas who are keeping a list of who's been naughty and who's been nice. And if they've been naughty, we kind of put distance between us and them because, it would offend our moral superiority and our righteousness. No, we're called to actually embody the way of Jesus. When someone's caught up in a mess, we move towards them. You see how your understanding of holiness will shape how you live in the world? If you've got an understanding of holiness that God can't be near sin, then if you see someone caught in sin, you won't move towards them because it would compromise your holiness. But if your understanding of holiness is actually rooted in the person of Jesus, you'll do the exact opposite. You'll move towards people who are in the middle of a mess. You'll take on and help carry their brokenness, all to reveal this God who did that for you. And I'm telling you, if we as a church, I'm talking about Crosspoint, so if you're visiting that Crosspoint, if we were to actually embody this, like in Lake Country, this type of holiness that moves towards people no matter what, that remains for them no matter what, we would be holy and set apart. We would be qualitatively different than anything the world has ever seen because we'd actually be looking and loving like Jesus. And this is the mission of our church. You go, what's Crosspoint about? I'll summarize it for you. Look, we follow a Jesus-looking God. We believe that God is revealed in the person of Jesus. We believe we're called to become a Jesus-looking people. That's what we're growing into as a community, and we're seeking to engage the world in a Jesus-looking way. Not a Pharisee-like way, not a cosmic Santa Claus way, a Jesus-looking way. Amen?